the one takeaway that I got from the weekend on Twitter, right? And of course, we all spent time on Twitter this weekend, right? What's going on? We're going to figure out Russia and Ukraine, and someone's going to tweet, and we're going to know all the answers. And it turns out that didn't work out at all, right? We've all been trying to understand what's going on there. We've looked at a million threads. Everyone's an expert. What we did see is guys like Glenn Greenwald and Mike Cernovich point out to us that the kind of unanimity, the kind of activity around all of these Ukraine discussions can't be trusted. There was something about it that was leading people astray. Now, I don't have proof one way or the other, but I know that today we're not going to be talking just about the war part. The war part, we're going to leave out. Advancing on this city, these weapons and those weapons, we don't know anything about it. Who's right, who's wrong? We have our ideas for sure. We've talked about them in other episodes, but today what we're going to talk about is just that myth-making piece, because we saw a lot of myth-making going on the weekend. We saw Zelensky, the president, stick around, or did he? We're not even going to determine whether that's right or not. What we do want to talk about first is the story from last Friday, Snake Island. If you remember Snake Island, everyone was talking about it. And there was a recording, and the Ukrainian soldiers on Snake Island were staring down a Russian boat in the water, and they said with their dying breath, "Go fuck yourself." But it turns out they're not dead. We found them. We think still fog of war. Remember, all of this stuff is fog of war, and that's why we don't really want to take the tact of trying to decipher what happened and what didn't. It looks like now that all of those soldiers that did say "go fuck yourself" and died in a blaze of glory are actually just prisoners now. A lot of these stories are going on, the myth making. And we're seeing in real time people adjusting entire worldviews. We're seeing people say, well, we're going to do it this way. We're going to rip SWIFT out of the ground, and we're going to sanction Russia, and we're going to do all of these things to the financial system, and it's going to stop the problems. Now, the trouble with myth making is that myths that last for a certain amount of time, especially a short amount of time, aren't the same as the great stories that last forever. They're not the same as the stories that were planted in the ground and took years to come to fruition. When I see news today, so we're not talking about Russia and Ukraine, but we're definitely going to talk about the SWIFT piece, because that's part of this myth making. Even Bitcoiners are looking at it today. So when we first saw what Satoshi had invented, I was living in Japan in that period, 08, 09, and then found Bitcoin a few years later from the political angle when we were looking into the Occupy Wall Street stuff and what were the answers to the bailouts and all the stuff that was going on. And because I was working for the Senate Banking Committee at the time, I had a pretty good visibility into what the central banks were doing, what the Anti-Terrorism, Anti-Money Laundering Act was doing, and that was sort of a good foundation to get into Bitcoin from that political end. When I first saw Satoshi Nakamoto's name, I don't know what happened, but from then on, I sort of thought that that Japanese piece had a lot to do with predictions, the future. We all knew that the name Satoshi Nakamoto was a pseudonym at the time, weren't really sure if we're going to figure out who it was. But what I knew as someone who had lived in Japan was that Japan regularly manipulated the market, the financial market, in order to keep the yen down and to be able to export goods to America. That was just a given. If you were earning yen at the time, you knew that if something went on in oil markets, for example, and I was there for the original war in Iraq, which did send commodity prices soaring, and Japan had to actively enter the Forex market to keep the yen suppressed so that they continue to export. The argument that a lot of people had was that Satoshi took the Japanese pseudonym to have that kind of moral authority to tell America in 2008, as it was printing the money, that they looked a lot like Japan in 1990. And that printing the money right then and there meant that in a few years' time, they would no longer be able to maintain global supremacy of the US dollar, and that it would fracture, and that another political money would come around, in this case, the Chinese yuan, and would fight the US dollar for supremacy. This is the sort of end result of the Triffin dilemma, basically. The Triffin dilemma being, what we hear a lot, especially around the 2008 crisis, is that American short-term policy would get eroded from long-term policy, that all these people with US dollars wouldn't allow America to do what needed to be done to fix the dollar, in 2008 and would cause all of this trouble. And so the argument at the time was, and this is, I believed I'd read an article at the time. I've since looked for it, that there was this article that explained Satoshi Nakamoto's Japanese name was to have the moral authority to tell America that what Japan did, you're about to get. You're not going to be able to use the levers of monetary policy to get out of this. And another dollar is going to take over, another money is going to take over. And therefore, you have Bitcoin, because it will mean that no political dollar can take over. Now, at the time, people were saying, what's a political dollar? This fiat money. But now, if we take a few days, just last week in Canada, we see that we have policy money, right? But it's also police money. It's policey money, policy money and police money. And this money could turn, the whole network can turn on individuals. We saw it in Canada. And that's where the P2P electronic cash system became such a novel idea, because you didn't have this third-party intermediary. And so we all know this stuff. There's nothing new in that. For me, what's new is this psychology engine piece. And I'm going to tie it into two different veins here. And it really, the first one is, so what we saw this weekend is that the SWIFT system, so SWIFT is the, what was the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecoms. Worldwide, it should be that, the Society for Worldwide Financial Telecoms. It's not. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecoms. And the SWIFT network is basically the, part of the system to clear all of these transactions. And it looked like last week there weren't going to be enough sanctions in place to really keep Russia from going on it. But it's like the collective hive mind of social media called out the hypocrites in Europe for not doing this, called out people all around the world to flex their muscles. And finally, Ursula von der Leyen, a central banker with the European Bank, said, second, we will paralyze the assets of Russia's central bank. This will freeze its transactions, and it will make it impossible for the central bank to liquidate its assets. Tur Demeester, a longtime Bitcoiner, reacted to this in Twitter and said, wow, until this moment, I never fully realized how vulnerable sovereign Forex reserves are. For better or worse, this is a landmark in the history of finance. He went on to tweet, countdown to central banks adding locally custodied Bitcoin to their balance sheets. So Tur Demeester now predicts that because of this financial schism, part of Satoshi's long-term vision is this two-pole system has been created. We've got China, and in this case, they said there's going to be a Russian wheat market and an oil market. We'll get to that, plus the ruble and yuan. Now, we have two systems that are entirely predicated, it looks like, on policies, that the policies are there to perpetuate these systems. And what the EU is saying here, what Ursula von der Leyen is saying, is that it's not going to work out, right? We're going to paralyze them. We're going to paralyze them. Now, there is a loophole, apparently. The EU banning transactions with the Russia Central Bank limits itself to transactions which will be processed if necessary to preserve the stability of the union or its members. So that means they can still use SWIFT if it's a question of stability. So they didn't go the full way for these sanctions on SWIFT, but it looks like it's serious, and Russia's got some real trouble. And so we've seen all over Twitter today, Russia is going to be sanctioned into the ground, and they're going to be super poor now, and this is millions of people who rely on the ruble that are going to starve. All of that might be true. I'm not here to say that that's not true. What I am here to say is that just today, Russia's Gazprom announced a major gas deal with China, construction of a new oil pipeline to supply 50 billion cubic meters per year of natural gas to China. So they're creating a separate economy, right? It has nothing to do at this moment with whether the ruble does well. If we look at foreign markets right now, energy prices are skyrocketing. That's Russia's de facto currency. It's the oil, it's the energy. So while the ruble is getting attacked and the banking system is getting attacked, the actual commodity value is going up. Now, Russia continues to hold that card because they have it with wheat as well. And last week, China said they would buy all the wheat, basically, Russia could make. So with wheat and oil, they've basically created a separate financial system now, a separate economy that they think is going to help perpetuate this peace in the future. So we've got this schism now. We've got SWIFT, the US dollar, the euro, the Canadian dollars, even the Swiss have joined. The Swiss joined this, right? They're always neutral, but even they said they're going to get into the financial sanctioning. So the Swiss, right, are going to get into this. So what this ends up leaving is a huge market, because the money has now ideologically divided itself over this weekend. Literally ideologically divided itself over the weekend. Exactly what Satoshi had more or less predicted, and I'm reading his mind because of the name. Once again, I always inferred the name was to have the moral authority of a Japanese person to say to an American, your monetary policy is broken. It's exactly like ours. The levers won't work. You're going to pull them and you're not going to get anything out of them. And it's going to give rise to this other power that's going to be able to manipulate these things on par with you. And you're just going to have to live with that. So in order to avoid all national currencies, the idea is that Bitcoin can take over. Now, what does it mean by taking over? That's really what this show today is about. And I want to point out a note from a guy named Adam Curtis. He's a documentary filmmaker for the BBC. And he was interviewed by The Economist just a few years ago. And he had invented, or he had tried to popularize a word, didn't invent it. He mentions he invented it called hyper-normalization. Hyper-normalization. So The Economist magazine asks him, what is hyper-normalization? Adam Curtis answers, what it was like living in the last years of the Soviet Union. What this intellectual who coined the phrase said, what he said was that in the 1990s, everyone from the top to the bottom of Soviet society knew that it wasn't working. They knew that it was corrupt. They knew that the bosses were looting the system. They knew that the politicians had no alternative vision. And they knew that the bosses knew that they knew. Everyone knew that it was fake. But because no one had an alternative vision for a different kind of society, they just accepted this sense of total fakeness as normal. There is a sense of everything being slightly unreal, that you fight a war that seems to cost you nothing and has no consequences at home, that money seems to grow on trees, that goods come from China and don't seem to cost you anything, that phones make you feel liberated, but that maybe you're being manipulated, but you're not quite sure, and it's all slightly odd, and it's all slightly corrupt. So he called this term hyper-normalization. And I want to hone in on one piece of that, which is this idea of a competing vision. So the reason hyper-normalization worked in Soviet Union at the end, because they didn't really know what happens tomorrow. They didn't really know. Just like the EU bankers who were pressured into the nuclear option on SWIFT, they don't really know what tomorrow offers, right? And they can say they understand, well, this will paralyze Russia. They might be right. But what if they're not? What if it doesn't paralyze Russia at all? What if Russia just says, well, we got a big buyer here, like the Gazprom deal. We don't care about the policy dollars. We sell commodities. Fiat money, it's just a bunch of words. Right? These are policing policy dollars. It's political systems. And if you don't present an alternative vision, it's very hard to do that myth-making part, right? So already we see Russia, China, definitely selling a vision of the future that is not with America. Even if that's only the point, is that it's not US dollar based. It's still a vision of the future that's different. What you see the EU try to do is hold on to that control they had and perpetuate more or less the same circumstances into the future. But of course, most people in America know that the system isn't working. I think that's widely felt. And a lot of people who find their way to Bitcoin certainly feel that and certainly know that there's something else out there that they want. And when we get into that world of myth-making, Bitcoiners have actually been in World War III for a long time now. It didn't start last week when Russia invaded Ukraine. The mindset has been here for a long time. And the prediction that the SWIFT network would break and there would be two separate economies in the world, a Chinese, Russia-ish one, and another one based on the internet that we recognize in America, would become a reality. And we're here now. So once again, we are completely on the timeline that Bitcoiners had already put in place. We are completely in that psychological space that Bitcoiners said we'd be in by now. And when we're thinking about psychological engines, and that's really what this show is about and what we're comparing here, we're comparing the ability for fiat currencies to perpetuate themselves into the future. Is it possible? Is the psychology intact for this thing to go in the future? Can they design a future that's worth fighting for, that people want and are interested in? I don't know. I don't know. I have my doubts. I can't see anything there that isn't a bunch of boomers looking, no offense, I have a lot of boomer friends. I try not to use boomer as derogatory as much as some people. Sometimes you can't help yourself. Are they really just promoting this stuff to a bunch of boomers, hoping that a boomer comes out of the night and saves them? There's another like JFK guy is going to come and, you know, lead all the public institutions and inspire everyone to civic duty and join the cause and get things done. You know, in some ways, that's what Zelensky is occupying as a space in the mind right now. Here's a leader. Here's someone who is different than the leaders we've known, and he's on the front lines and shooting guns. And maybe all that is true about Zelensky. I don't know. Right now, this show isn't about Zelensky. It's about the people who can make the future and who can perpetuate the future. And when I look at that competing visions, Bitcoiners have no lack of vision for what the future looks like. It obviously doesn't include seed oils, right? We know that. It doesn't include seed oils. But let's just take a look, because the frame for Bitcoiners for World War III is not Russia fights Ukraine and then a bunch of other countries come in and then some new institutions are built and countries win, and then there's winning countries and losing countries. We've covered World War III on this show a bunch. In the view of a lot of people in Bitcoin, the view that World War III is fought on, the tensions are between states and individuals, like what we saw in Canada last week, like what we saw in Canada. So a state using the banking system to impose sanctions on individuals, the same kind of sanctions we're talking about today that have been put on Russia and other countries, right? So it's the use of these tools at the state level or the individual level. And Bitcoiners' idea of the future contrasts with that. Now, we can take one of the larger Bitcoiners in the world, Elon Musk, and give you an idea of the real fault lines of World War III as they happened this weekend. So we saw Russia is fighting Ukraine and this and that, and who's the heroes, and we don't know, and good guys. We know there's bad guys. We got the bad guys checked out, but who are the good guys? Well, how about this? Elon Musk joined the fight by bringing the Starlink satellites to Ukraine this week, right? So this is an individual acting as at the capacity of the state, intervening in a conflict and really tipping the balance. If you're adding spatial satellite communications to a battlefield that can't be suppressed by either side, you've done something we've never seen in the history of warfare ever before, I don't think. We've seen states do it. We've seen America come in and put up a mesh network. Did you know POMP? You know, everyone talks about POMP, right? And maybe they don't give enough respect. I don't know if people know what POMP did. POMP set up the internet network, the nodes in the Iraq war for the internet to actually work. He was a soldier for the US Army that helped set up this entire network. He knows a lot about mesh networks and deploying them. And that's one frame that he used to get into Bitcoin. He understood the value of a network like that in a war zone. So states did do it before, but now we have a human who came in and did it. We heard Russia say that you're not going to get to take rides up on the Russian space program anymore to the space station. Well, Elon just tweeted them the logo of SpaceX. That just ended it. SpaceX, leave me alone. But what I think is the most important story, besides the satellites being incredible, is that Elon Musk this weekend joined the Ripple lawsuit against the SEC. It has been my belief for many years that Elon Musk was fighting a public opinion war against the SEC, that most things that he was doing in regards to Dogecoin and all this other stuff was really just a way to frame a fight that he had with a really important and obtrusive public institution. Now, it turns out the SEC is trying to increase the definition, the threshold for accredited investor as we speak. So already trying to increase the threshold to participate in American capitalism and the ability to make money in America, they're literally capping it and have capped it since the 30s at an extraordinary amount. And so at the same time, you've got Elon Musk trying this fight out. And what we see is that he's fighting against the short sellers. He's fighting against everyone who's been influencing the market against them. And this has been him building a case for years, it turns out. This isn't a new thing. He's been building this case for years, something I suspected for a long time. And if you look at the world that we live in right now with Bitcoin, so we've got this creation of a two system now, it's bifurcated. We've got the American system with oil and SWIFT and the US dollar and the euro and the Canadian dollar. We've got wheat and oil and the renminbi and the ruble on this side, but that money isn't as important as this as far as currency goes. So their fiat currencies aren't as important as their commodities. But the third option, of course, is what Elon Musk just showed you, which is the true type of money we're trying to create here, which is fuck you money. And by fuck you money, I mean being able to launch a satellite, many satellites, to influence the internet coverage during a war, or to fight against a country's bargaining chip of a space program, or even to fight against one of the most obtrusive American institutions on the ability to go out and make money. He's literally said to everyone, fuck you, this week. That's truly fuck you money. And the vision that Satoshi gave us isn't so much that we're all as rich in fiat as Elon Musk is to be able to tell countries to go fuck themselves. But it's to fulfill, in some ways, what the Snake Island mythology failed to fulfill, right? They told an army to go fuck yourself on that boat, got caught up in the old world of myth making. What's true, what isn't true, we don't know. But we know that in Bitcoin, the true goal is to create real fuck you money that can't be shut down and that can't be stopped, so that you can, in fact, stare at a ship at sea that threatens war on you and say, fuck you, go fuck yourself, and mean it, and not have all these systems collapse around you and fail to get you there. So for me, what I see today, to conclude all of this, is that what's most important is that you're offering a vision in the future. We started a war that most people now acknowledge looks like World War III. Who's really fighting for a competing vision of the future on the American, SWIFT, EU side? I don't know. I'm asking it as a real question. What is the vision? Is it we keep it the same as it is, except the EU doesn't have to deal with China anymore and Russia, and we can ignore the Russian oil and the Russian wheat, and it doesn't matter what it does for global prices? Maybe. Maybe it's just two separate poles and we never live together again, and it perpetuates into the future, hyper-normalized like it was in the end of the Soviet Union. Or a new vision built off of fuck you money takes root even more, and people realize they can't be stopped, and all the truckers go to Bitcoin, and all the other institutions that we would need end up saying, this looks like a better future than the one being offered by the current myth makers. Because the current myth makers are telling you that people got shot, but they didn't. We're telling you people might get shot, but we've got to get to a point where we can say fuck you and it wouldn't make a difference. So that's the episode of The Breakup today.